Great.
the recording. Thank you very much for joining me, Ambassador. It's really good to see you. I appreciate it. I think we have good shot. Everything looks good. So let's talk about Afghanistan. You're following the news, and you have seen a lot of women being the forefront of the protests for past few days. But we don't see a lot of international reaction. And why the international community is so silent about women movement in Afghanistan?
Well, Zheela, I think that we're seeing a real mismatch between what people said before the fall of Kabul and what they've been willing to do since the fall of Kabul. Essentially, you had a lot of rhetoric about the situation of women and the potential dire situation that women would face under Taliban rule, used as talking points all the way up until August the 14th. And then even after August the 14th, after Kabul fell, you heard a lot of leaders talking about women. But the reality on the ground is that at-risk women, whether they were high-profile former ministers all the way down to women who were working in domestic violence shelters, have been utterly left behind in this evacuation and in the policy decisions around how both the United States and other major powers are dealing with the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan by force. And the reality is that among the women that we were working with, that myself and others, whether through the U.S. Afghan Women's Council or through other channels that we had engaged with over the years, many of those women are still, I would say actually the overwhelming majority of those women are still in Kabul there or still somewhere in Afghanistan hiding with their families. They were unable to access the airport during the evacuation. They were not prioritized in a meaningful sense by any of the major powers. Some of the European countries did a good job of targeting key women and helping them to be able to get out. But overall, the effort to support women, women leaders at the national all the way down to the local level has been absolutely appalling since the fall of Kabul. And then you see who is making all the decisions and who is doing all the talking about everything in Afghanistan right now. It's not just in the Taliban that it's all male. In our own government, it's just a parade of men talking about Afghanistan and not really taking into account what has happened to the women of the country, or even very meaningfully concerned about it.
So there's no woman in Taliban new cabinet, and the women ministry somehow omitted or deleted. What message it tells the world what on Taliban's stance on respecting women's rights in Afghanistan?
Well, I think despite what the Taliban has said and the rhetoric that they've put forward about how they will respect women's rights, I think that people stopped listening after they said they would respect women's rights and forgot to listen to the rest of it, which they said under Sharia law. And their version of Sharia law, as we all know, is quite harsh and quite regressive when it comes to the rights of women. And they historically have not treated women as equals, as equal human beings of equal worth and value, and have historically had a very backwards, I would say, view of the rights of women, and not allowed women to participate fully in society. And I think that we're now seeing that they haven't really changed. Nothing has meaningfully changed when it comes to how the Taliban thinks about the rights and the roles of women in public life in Afghanistan.
So some of women in this process were beaten as well. And recently Taliban segregated some of these universities in the classes and separated women and men. And so what do we see for the future of Afghan women with the Taliban ruling? Somehow you touch on it, but what it's telling us, what will happen to women?
Well, I think that, people are going to look at those situations and say, oh, well, at least Afghan women are able to go to university, even if they have to be on the other side of a curtain. And I think that people who say things like that, they really have a very limited understanding of how much women had been able to accomplish in the past 20 years and the incredible strides that the Afghan women had made over that time period. And it wasn't something that the United States gave these women. Let's be very clear. It was something that Afghan women themselves fought for and were determined to secure their own rights for the past 20 years. And even during the democratic period, during the Islamic Republic, they still had to fight very hard. And women were still disproportionately assassinated, disproportionately targeted for abuse, even in the parliament. And so I think that the idea that that it was just something that the United States or the West was trying to force on Afghanistan is, first of all, a completely false narrative. These are rights that Afghan women were demanding for themselves and fighting for and dying for themselves. And now, now that they had achieved so many things, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to go back to accepting something much, much less than that, which is the situation they face under Taliban rule. So I think you're going to continue to see women fighting, trying to find ways to fight for their rights. And you're going to see women continuing to be at the vanguard, and just as they have been in so many other places where the rules that previously governed their society, which were, men with guns get to rule, have led to societal failure and terrible things happening to countries. There needs to be a complete reevaluation of how we think about these issues, how we think about peace issues, how we think about national security, and an understanding that sidelining women when it comes to national security, whether it's here in this country or in a place like Afghanistan, only leads to cycles of violence and deprivation and societal fragility and weakness and instability that harms everyone in the country and the region and globally.
So, Ambassador, what the U.S. and prominent women like Hillary Clinton, Laura Bush, and also Senator Shaheen, that they really work so hard for Afghan women, they have to do to make sure the Taliban will respect women's rights and they will not ignore women's rights in the context of even leading the country?
Unfortunately, our first challenge is here in Washington, D.C., a little closer to home, to get the Biden administration to actually take the situation seriously and to do more to really help Afghan women and to recognize that this is not a nice to have thing. This is not some luxury or a boutique issue, but that the security and safety of Afghan women, the protection of their rights, is absolutely at the core of our national security challenge with regard to Afghanistan. And that Afghanistan will continue to be an unstable, poor, failed country if women cannot fully participate in that society. And that because that is the Taliban's agenda, that we have to be very serious in thinking through what kind of assistance, what kind of cooperation, especially on security cooperation. And any conversation about security cooperation has to begin and end with thinking about the role of women. And I know that may sound extreme to people who don't think of security and counterterrorism in those terms, but the way that we've been doing it up to now clearly has not worked. And I think that we need to be very serious about doing things a different way in order to get a different outcome.
Yeah, so Trump negotiation with the Taliban also didn't include women. And it started from there. So for 18 months, there was no loss. But recently, with the attack of ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, 13 Marines killed. So what is it telling us? That Taliban didn't cut the ties with Al-Qaeda, and at the same time, they have not respected women at all.
I think it was well known. It was, open source information that Al Qaeda and the Haqqani network and ISIS, Khorasan were all still quite well active in Taliban held areas before they began their lightning advance. And this was not a secret to anyone. And I was very consistent inside the Trump administration calling for greater participation for women. And there was an effort made. Unfortunately, it was too late, and it was only as part of the inter-Afghan dialogue where the administration insisted on having women participate in the Afghan government side. I think that they did make a big difference when they were there. But unfortunately, all of that has collapsed because those negotiations were done only after the United States had basically given everything over to the Taliban that they wanted. And we did that without enough coordination with the Afghan government. And so I think that there is plenty of responsibility for how badly things have gone. But I will say that the Biden administration was under no obligation to maintain the deeply flawed elements of the deal that they inherited. And they knew that the Taliban was in violation of even its minimal obligations under that deal and could have gone back in from a position of strength and renegotiated it. Instead, they just did things like giving up Bagram and setting arbitrary deadlines, and then refusing to take a conditions-based approach to withdrawal. So I think that we are now in a situation where we're dealing with the consequences of, again, like I said, very poor policy making that sidelined the needs of the communities in the country, that sidelined women's voices for decades. And Afghan women have fought very hard for a seat at the table, and we're just starting to really achieve some of those goals in the past few years, but it was clearly insufficient to head off what has happened now. And it's very disappointing to see the United States government enabling the crushing of these women's voices in the way that they have.
Just last question. I'm sure a lot of women reach out for evacuation or help to get out of Afghanistan. To you, are you still involved? And what do you see the future of evacuation? How these women can be helped? I have a Woman of Courage Award. She's right now in Istanbul. She called me, and I have a few other female journalists. They're calling me. They even don't know how to apply a visa or how to get out. This is too tough. So, are you involved? What are you hoping for this saving Afghan women lives?
Yes, I'm familiar with the story of one of our Women of Courage award recipients who was able, fortunately, to escape and is now, waiting to be allowed into the United States. And, again, this is a person who is known to the United States. There's no security threat, and she has a full sponsorship. She has people ready to welcome her here and provide her employment, provide her all the assistance she needs, and she's just sitting waiting. Unfortunately, the way, again, that this evacuation was carried out, it's created tiers of people who, if you got out on a military plane or landed on a military base, then you are being processed and you're being paroled into the United States without a whole lot of paperwork. If, on the other hand, you were taken to a third country and you weren't on a military base, you're having to go through an excruciating gauntlet of paperwork and get through a lot of waiting and no real plan, being turned away by embassies that are supposed to help you, being turned away by UNHCR. We're seeing a lot of this kind of thing happening to Afghan women who have gotten out that we're talking to. And then the third category is the women who were left behind, who are still stuck inside Afghanistan with their families. And they are even in a more hopeless situation because the Biden administration continues to rely upon the goodwill of the Taliban in letting these women out of the country, which is, I don't even know where to begin with how unlikely it is that the Taliban will live up to their promises to allow these women and their families to leave. So far, they're not even allowing American citizens to leave Mazar-e-Sharif. So why would they allow these at-risk women to cross a border? And then you have the problem of the neighboring countries becoming much more strict because they don't see any real initiative from the United States to help support those who are escaping from Afghanistan or a real path out of their countries. And they don't want to, again, be burdened with millions of Afghan refugees.